Hi, my name is Bernardo Malfitano, and this is going to be a presentation about vertical takeoff and landing aircraft, meaning those that can hover, take off straight up, and or land straight down. Now this is supposed to be a really short presentation, so I'm just going to get right to it. But after the presentation, I'll give you some more details like information about me and how the presentation came to be, and I'll tell you where to download the slides if you want. So you can stick around after the presentation for those details if you want. But for now, here's the presentation. Alright, VTOL aircraft history. Where do we start? As you know, most airplanes can't take off and land without a long runway, and runways are expensive and inconvenient, and they make for easy targets in a war. Also, airplanes can't hover, so it's tricky to release things from an airplane onto the ground or to pick things up from the ground with an airplane. Helicopters can do these things, but they're slow and they use a lot of fuel. And it would be nice to have an aircraft that can hover like a helicopter, but that has the speed and the range of an airplane. And the militaries of the world have been investigating this concept for decades. They call this capability vertical takeoff and landing, or VTOL. Now, most people know about the Harrier jump jet and the V-22 Osprey and the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, but those are a tiny tip of a much larger iceberg of VTOL airplanes. The objective of this presentation is to teach you about the many other VTOL designs that have been flown. I'm not going to talk about every single one, but the slides will pretty much list all of their names. And that's enough information for you to Google whichever ones you'd like to learn more about. The presentation will cover a variety of VTOL aircraft configurations, starting with helicopters. These are the most successful and common type of VTOL aircraft, and most people are pretty familiar with these. The basic principle is you move the wings relative to the rest of the aircraft, so air is flowing over the wings, or rotor blades, and generating lift even when the aircraft is stationary. The idea dates back at least as far as Leonardo da Vinci in the 1400s. The first successful rotorcraft was Juan de la Cierva's autogyro in 1923, and the first helicopter as we know them today was flown by Igor Sikorsky in the 30s. Of course, helicopters today are used as ambulances, or for law enforcement, news gathering, fighting wildfires, transportation to remote sites, and all kinds of military applications, so they're a big and diverse part of the aviation ecosystem and have been for a while. The problem with helicopters is that when they fly forwards, as each rotor spins around, it flies into the wind on its way forwards and then retreats on its way back. The faster the helicopter flies, the less efficiently the retreating rotor blade can generate lift, or thrust for that matter. Compound helicopters aim to lessen this problem by including wings that generate lift at high speed, or engines or propellers to generate thrust. Some of them even try to stop the rotor in flight. As you can see, these are basically hybrids between helicopters and airplanes. One of the earliest ones, the Bell 533, still holds the speed record for rotorcraft, 316 miles an hour. Currently, the Sikorsky X2 and the Eurocopter X Cubed are the newest and most modern compound helicopters. And here's a different approach. Take a normal airplane, but say that the thrust that the engines can generate is a greater force than the airplane's weight. So if the airplane's pointed straight up, it can then be lifted up by engine power alone and go straight up like a rocket. The only problem then is landing this airplane back onto its tail, essentially while flying in reverse with the pilot looking over their shoulder. The tail structure has to be strong, there has to be control systems designed especially for that kind of flying, and so on. But these tail sitters were the earliest VTOL airplanes. The Nazis had the idea in World War II. The Convair XFY was the first one to actually fly in 1954. The X-13 was the first VTOL jet in 1955. It took off and landed from that platform there on the top right. Some rockets have been operated like this, and even some UAVs today use this configuration. Now, jet platforms. Now, these were just research test beds made to see whether a jet engine could be mounted vertically and lift an aircraft off the ground for a while, and whether reaction control systems could be developed that blew exhaust gases off of little tubes in order to stabilize and control and turn the aircraft. These aren't practical for transportation. They're even less fuel efficient than a helicopter. The only practical application was flying a lunar lander simulator to train the Apollo astronauts. You can see that on the top right there, and if you search for that on YouTube, there's a fun video of Neil Armstrong crashing one. He survives, of course. Anyways, the British had one, you can see it there on the top left. The Germans had one on the lower left, and the French had one that looked like a rocket with a seat on top. I wonder who drew the short straw for that first flight. The use of lift engines is basically the combination of one of those jet platforms with a normal airplane. You have normal horizontal cruise engines and wings for horizontal flight, and then additional lift engines mounted vertically for hovering. Two huge problems. One, the lift engines are heavy and they subtract from your payload. And two, redundancy is impractical because they're so heavy. So if any of the lift engines fail during hover, you pretty much lose the aircraft. The British built one of these, the French built two, one based on the Mirage 3 and one on the Mirage 4. Lockheed tried it, the Germans tried it, they pretty much built an airplane around that jet platform that I showed you earlier. And the Russian Navy actually put these into service on their aircraft carriers, and then retired them after 37 crashes. Remember, if you lose any of the multiple engines during hover, you lose the airplane. Thrust vectoring was the first really successful VTOL configuration. The idea is to have a movable engine nozzle that can direct the engine exhaust downwards for vertical thrust or just backwards for normal horizontal flight. You don't need multiple engines all working all the time, just one, so it's safer. The only problem is that a movable engine nozzle like this tends to be suboptimal, so you get a little bit less thrust out of your engine than you otherwise would, but that's a relatively minor issue. The Russian tried this on the Yakolev 36, Bell also tried it with the X-14, and the Harrier jump jet has been flying since the 1960s. It's been used by a few different countries, and it's arguably the most successful VTOL airplane ever built. Now, the Boeing X-32 lost the Joint Strike Fighter competition against the X-35, and that's the only other airplane that uses this configuration. Another idea, instead of just tilting the nozzle of a jet engine, you can tilt the rotor or the fan or the propeller of the engine or the whole engine or the whole wing with the engine attached to it. The advantages are that you don't need a reaction control system blowing hot exhaust out of little holes to turn the hovering aircraft. You can just control it like a helicopter. And this tilt-rotor configuration, like a helicopter, tends to use less fuel to hover than a jet does. However, it is more complex, and the top speed of the aircraft ends up being more like a propeller airplane, not a jet's. There have been way too many of these since 1954 to go over all of them. The French, the Germans, even the Canadians have created them. The most successful one is the V-22 Osprey, which had a rocky start but is now in service in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's based on the smaller XV-15 prototype. And also based on the same design, Bell is developing a civilian version, the Bell 609, which has nearly the speed and range of a business jet. Order yours today. Another idea is to embed a fan inside a wing or in the fuselage and have it blow downwards. It takes some volume, but not much weight, so you can just stretch your airplane a little bit and carry about as much stuff as you could if the fan weren't there. You can power the fan from the shaft of the engine, so you just need one engine. The engine nozzle can be vectored downwards to help the fan, or you can just have it point straight back and be optimized for horizontal flight. The only tricky thing here is transitioning from fan-supported lift into wing-supported lift when the engine starts accelerating the airplane forwards from a hover, but if you have some excess thrust, you'll be fine, and it's been done. Other than for a couple of unsuccessful experimental prototypes, the only airplane to use this configuration is the Lockheed Joint Strike Fighter, which does carry the most powerful engine of any fighter ever built, and even then it can't take off vertically fully loaded. Now, this final group is just a miscellaneous category with all kinds of crazy stuff. The military has explored a lot of possibilities in trying to create small aircraft to transport individual soldiers over a battlefield, and most of them have been VTOL designs since the terrain can be kind of rough out there. The payload is just one person, so the aircraft can be tiny and simple with a vertical source of thrust, a rocket, a jet engine, a ducted fan, or a helicopter rotor. Most notable is probably the Bell rocket belt, which has been seen in James Bond movies, and people today still fly replicas of these. There are also people around the world, such as Zenai Yanagisawa and Franz Schaffman, who built tiny one-person helicopters. The Solartrek XFV was an exciting aircraft that barely got off the ground 10 years ago, and now the NASA Puffin will try to make this concept a reality, the first personal tail-sitter. And as exciting as these may look, most of them have an endurance of about 20 seconds, some of them as long as 5 minutes, so they're not practical transportation, but they still look like fun. Whew. So, for more information, you can visit vstol.org, where they have this huge wheel that talks about most of the airplanes that I just mentioned, divided into pretty similar categories. There's also a series of videos called Straight Up that's really great. I'm a big fan of it. And there's no shortage of books out there about these airplanes in the past, present, and future. So I hope that today expanded your knowledge about these unusual aircraft and maybe even got you excited about the possibility of someday getting into an airplane without having to drive to the airport. Again, please download the slides so you can see the names of all these airplanes I showed, and feel free to do research on the ones that look most interesting. Google and YouTube and Wikipedia will definitely show you interesting content and anecdotes that I didn't have time to mention here, like the German Do-31, which was a huge airplane that had a Harrier engine under each wing, as well as 8 vertically mounted lift jet engines at the wingtips. Or the test flights of the Ryan XV-5 that tried to simulate a rescue by pulling up a guy on a cable towards the airplane, but the guy was ingested into one of the fans. It's one of those stories from the world of experimental aviation that would be almost funny if it weren't really tragic. And speaking of time, I'm all out of it. Thanks for watching. Alright, I hope you enjoyed that. I guess the first thing I should make sure I don't forget to say is where you can download the slides for the presentation. That way you can actually read the names of the airplanes that were shown on the slides, written very, very small. You can download the slides and see this video and so on at airplanedesign.info/Pecha-Kucha. Now as for background, my name is Bernardo Malfitano. I go by AirShowFan on Reddit and Boing Boing and Flightblogger and Slashdot and most of the other websites that I frequent. I've been an aviation geek my whole life, reading everything I can about airplanes and the development of different aviation technologies and watching all those videos on the Discovery Channel and all those things. And while I was in college, I created and taught a class about the history of aviation technology, and I managed to get all the material taught for the class just over 1 week before finals started. So I said, hey, I kind of have this special interest in vertical takeoff and landing aircraft, and they're kind of fun and different. So as a fun lecture, before finals, I'll teach the last class about VTOL airplanes, and it's optional. Of course, since I made it optional and it was the week before finals, nobody came. But I kind of saved all the materials and said, oh, one day I'll present this somehow, I think. So now I work at Boeing, and let's see, one of the things that I'm involved in other than the engineering work that I do for a living at Boeing that I was hired to do is knowledge management. So I try to encourage different departments within Boeing, basically everything I touch, to try to incorporate Web 2.0 platforms. A lot of things within Boeing could benefit from being documented in wikis and forums and things like that, but a lot of people at Boeing don't like that for a lot of reasons. They want to hoard knowledge instead of share it, and that's a long discussion I could have. But one aspect of this is that a lot of Boeing's workforce is around 50. They could retire soon, and then there's a lot of 50-year-olds and a lot of 20-something-year-olds like me. So the 20-something-year-olds are doing everything we can to try to get the 50-year-olds to share as much of their knowledge as they'd be willing, so that when they leave, the knowledge doesn't walk out the door with them. And one common way of sharing knowledge within Boeing and other large companies and organizations is PowerPoint. And I'm sure you're familiar with the idea of death by PowerPoint. You have these long presentations that never end, the slides are complicated, and the person just spends a long time talking about these details that aren't that important. And what some designers in Japan came up with was this idea of a presentation where you only have 20 slides and each of them can only last for 20 seconds. They call this Pecha-Kucha, which means something like chit-chat. And I think it's an onomatopoeia, similarly to chit-chat. And this is getting kind of big in the art world. It's a way to show your portfolio really quick. And of course it's really quick, so if you have a short attention span, it's over in 6 minutes and 40 seconds or something like that. And so a few people at Boeing have thought, well, maybe this is a good way to get knowledge sharing going and get people willing to just stand up and say something really quick and sit down, and it's not in depth and it's not technical, but it's just here's an overview of how this went or something like that. And to start experimenting with this idea, we started presenting just things that are interesting to us. Talk about a book you've read that has a message that's interesting, or a course you took, or your hobby, or something like that. And so I had this idea, well, maybe I can shorten my lecture about vertical takeoff landing airplanes from an hour to 6 minutes and 40 seconds. And so that's what I try to do. When I actually presented it, I was better about talking really, really, really fast. So I actually covered pretty much all that material in the allotted time. In this recording that you just saw, I allowed myself to talk a little bit slower. So each of the slides took, 25 seconds instead of 20. But if I talk really, really fast, I could shorten that down to a proper, strict Pecha-Kucha presentation. Except for the first slide and the last slide. Those I just gave myself, a lot of time to introduce a talk and to close up the talk. But again, if I really wanted to, I could trim a lot of that stuff out. And if you're interested in setting up a Pecha-Kucha session or insight talks, or there's lots of little things that are going on that try to follow some kind of short format presentation style, I would recommend it. It's fun. It gets people a chance to get up in front of a lot of other people and give a talk, and it's really fast. A lot of people can do it in an hour or even in half an hour, and it's really fun, and it's really different. It's very hard to be concise and to say only the things that you really need to say to get the overall idea across. 20 seconds per slide and only 20 slides. It's pretty crazy. And just for the fun, just for the fun of it and for the experience, I would recommend it. And hopefully this serves as a decent example of a Pecha-Kucha talk. Pretty soon I'm going to be giving one about stealth aircraft design, and I'll try to make a recording and a video of that as well, and put that online. So again, thanks for watching. I hope you learned something, and maybe this will help inspire you to do some Pecha-Kucha yourself.